Gainesville is the largest city in Alachua County and considered one of the best places to live in Florida. It has a small town feel and it's known for the University of Florida, a well-regarded research centre. However, this was about to change very quickly in the summer of 1990 when the students of the city were terrorised, leaving residents living in fear as to when and where the killer would strike next. It was August 1990 and the school was starting to fill up with university students for the new semester. On August 26, there was a call to the police department. A maintenance worker had called police, which was advised by his manager at the time, because the parents of Christine Powell, who was 17, and Sonia Larson, 18, had not been heard from in a couple of days. Christina's parents arrived at the apartment complex as they lived closer and wanted the maintenance worker to let them in. Police had arrived at the Williamsburg Village Apartments where both students had only just moved into and both were about to start Florida University for the new semester. Police noticed Christina's car was still parked up at the apartments, but there was no answer at the door. Police pushed the door open with the apartment's maintenance worker and manager and Christina's parents waiting outside the apartment. They found Sonia Larson in the bed with multiple stab wounds and there was blood everywhere, and Christina was found dead in the downstairs living room. She had been raped, murdered and mutilated and posed in a crude way. The medical examiner for the case, William Hamilton, felt it was of a Bundy-style type serial killer, and the fear was that this would not be an isolated case. Dish soap had been left on the floor, which had been used to try and destroy any evidence. The positioning of Christina's body would suggest that whoever did it wanted to shock whoever found them. Just 2 miles away, and 9 hours after the discovery of Christina and Sonia, sheriffs had been alerted to the fact that their colleague, 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, hadn't turned up for her midnight shift on the 26th of August. This was unusual, as Krista was never late. Krista was a clerk for the Alachua County Sheriff's Department and also a student studying chemistry to become a crime lab technician at Santa Fe College. When her co-workers went to check on her at a duplex, they found her body. She was naked and slumped forward on the bed. She had been decapitated and posed. Later results would suggest that she had been sexually battered in the lead up to her murder. In a 9-hour period, 3 bodies, all female students, had been found. Residents of Gainesville were in shock and fear set in straight away. On the morning of the 28th, friends of 2 students called the sheriff's department saying they haven't been able to find their friends, Manny Taboda and his friend Tracy Paulus, both 23, are missing, and could they check the residence. When sheriffs turned up and gained entry, they found Tracy's naked body just inside the front door. There was a blood-soaked bed where Manny had put up a fight after being stabbed several times. This added panic to the community of Gainesville, as now it seems nobody was safe. A man or a woman, Manny, who was physically fit and strong, seemed to add another layer of fear. Within 3 days, Gainesville had huge media attention. All media outlets descended on Gainesville to report on the terrifying situation. Students left to go back home, and some cancelled their places at the Florida University and Santa Fe College. People were told to stay inside and also stay in groups if they were to go anywhere. There was a curfew in place, and residents bought guns and weapons to protect themselves and their families. Local gun store owners were all sold out, including locks for doors. Rumours of who it could be were running rife, from a pizza delivery driver to a man in uniform to a doctor. The media dubbed the killer the Gainesville Ripper. At the crime scene, investigators would describe the killer as meticulous and calculated. Each of the women had been left in a crude position, as almost to shock whoever would find them. He would have stalked them and picked out his victims. Investigators found that this killer liked to take his time in mentally and physically torturing his victims, with the exception of Manny Taboda. Each of the victims had long dark hair and was described as petite. He entered apartments with sliding doors and rear doorways that backed onto woodland areas where he watched his chosen victim. The way he sliced the clothes off the victims with a knife, this was evident in all crime scenes. He had also worn gloves so as not to leave fingerprints behind. He basically cleaned up any evidence that could be used to find him. In 3 days, 5 people were now murdered, and now suddenly the killer had gone quiet. Nobody could relax wondering when and who the next victim would be. National and local task forces looked for links between the victims. All victims were either in University of Florida or Santa Fe College. Although they were all in different programs, all excelled in their chosen subjects. Apart from Manny, the women looked similar with hair colouring and were petite. Due to the shape and width of the stab wounds, investigators determined that the knife used was a Marine K-bar, a combat knife sold in many shops. All the crime scenes were similar in that all the victims had sticky residue left from being bound with tape, and markings and damage from the entryways showed how he'd got in. All in all, investigators recovered 18,000 pieces of evidence collected from all the crime scenes. Evidence found on Christina Powell's underwear and paper tissue nearby provided DNA, including DNA from Krista Hoyt's crime scene, were found as a match, meaning it was the same man. There was a list of 675 men who needed to be interviewed and have blood taken. This required a special squad to be able to do this. One name stood out, and that was 18-year-old Edward Lewis Humphreys. He was a student who had been evicted from the same apartment complex as Manny Taboda and Tracy Paulus lived in. He had a reputation for being weird and was seen in combat gear carrying a knife, threatening other residents. He was often talking about how he could skin other people using a certain knife. This certainly caught the attention of police officers. He got arrested for an unrelated assault charge for beating his grandmother. Police felt that this could be their man, and a bond was set for $1 million. This now spread through the Gainesville community that the Ripper had been caught, and this was now the end of the horrific ordeal. However, when police searched Edward Humphreys' residence, in which he lived with his grandmother, they were shocked to see how the man was spiralling out of control mentally. One source said there was a clear indication of a split personality, when one side of his room was neat and tidy, and the other side was eerie and dark with things smashed up, with a collection of knives and chaos. It seemed that his decline in mental health was a major factor in his behaviour, as Humphrey had stopped taking his medication. Still, the apartment did not turn up any new evidence, so the search extended to rivers, ponds and streams, and wooded surroundings, hoping to find something. As time went on, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab came back with results. Blood taken from all 3 crime scenes were a match, concluding that the same man had committed all 5 crimes, but they did not match Humphrey's blood, which was type A. The killer was a secretor, which meant enzymes would be in all bodily fluids, including spit, mucus and semen. The killer was blood type B. Investigators decided to use a program called VCAP. This is where the information can be put into the system, such as details of the crime scene and victims, etc., to see if it flagged up any other similar crimes that had also been put into the system. This time they had a hit, and it was a triple homicide case in Shreveport, Louisiana. This report stuck out because killings were similar, as they had been stabbed, and the student who had a similar appearance as the Gainesville students was also killed and posed. Shreveport Police Department had a suspect in mind, but he had been on the run. He was a drifter called Danny Rowling, who was well known to the police, having led a life of crime, and bank robberies being something that Danny was known for, led the Gainesville investigators to see if any robberies had happened in Gainesville at the time of the murders. Interestingly, there had been a hold-up at the First Union on the morning Krista Hoyt's body had been found, and not far from where she'd lived. Although the suspect at the time had been chased by deputies, they lost him in the wooded area. A week later, and 40 miles from Gainesville, a grocery store was also robbed, but this time the suspect was caught and arrested, and as it turned out, it was Danny Rowling. Danny Rowling had a hideout in the woods, and it turned up an array of clues. Items seized from the hideout revealed they were all evidence linking to the perpetrator to the robberies, as there were banknotes that had been covered in red dye. The bank teller would have put a dye pack in the bag, so when the pack explodes, the money can't be used. And the evidence linking the Gainesville crime scenes, which was blood, tape and pubic hair, was all found out at the hideout, and was tested, which was linked to the victims of Gainesville. Also an audio tape with Danny's strange ramblings of love for his family and singing etc., but then explains how he likes to kill and stab people by aiming for the lungs. Then finally he actually states his name in the audio tape. After all of this, he signs off saying he has something he's got to do. A screwdriver found at the camp had markings that matched the damage on the doorways the perpetrator had used to gain entry at each of the crime scene. Florida Department of Law Enforcement knew by now that Danny Rolling had been in the military and asked to gain access to his medical records. The results came back as blood type B. It was now confirmed that Danny Rolling is the Gainesville Ripper. He was now indicted for 5 murders. Investigators were worried that this would not be enough to convince the jury. They needed more. They still needed Danny Rolling to confess. Investigators learned that Danny has been talking and bragging in his cell about the details of the Gainesville murders, and had also written a letter in which he had details that only the killer would know. Getting Danny Rolling to confess was done using a carefully prepared script that would appeal to his ego. They wanted him to feel like he was the star of the show. However, Danny Rolling threw a bit of a curveball. He would only talk through his cellmate, Bobby Lewis. Danny thought that if he confessed through someone else, they would not be able to convict him. It ended up being a long process, but they finally got the confession they needed. On April 1994, in the trial, Rolling admitted he was guilty and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. After Danny Rolling was sentenced to death, he admitted that he was the killer in Shreveport, Louisiana triple homicide in 1989. Tom Grissom, aged 55, a divorcee, lived in the Southern Hills neighborhood of Shreveport. His daughter Julie, aged 24, was studying marketing at Louisiana State University and was about to graduate. She was a similar appearance as the Gainesville victims in that she had long dark hair and was described as petite. She had also been posed with her hair fanned out. Lastly, Sean, who was just 8 years old, was visiting his grandfather and aunt as part of a birthday celebration and was meant to be coming home on the Monday, November the 6th. It was only when Sean's mother couldn't get hold of the family and found out on Monday that Sean had not gone to school that she called the police. Apparently neighbours were asked by police to go over and just check the family. It was by 8:45 on the Monday morning. Bodies had been found. Both Sunday and Monday newspapers were found at the end of the driveway. Detectives believe that Tom, his daughter Julie and grandson Sean were killed between 6 to 8 p.m. on Saturday. At this stage, Danny was well known to the police and had continual run-ins with the law. He lived with his mum and dad only 10 minutes away from the Grissom household. Months later, Rolling fled the area after shooting his father in the head over a dispute. Luckily though, his father survived it. It is easy to see why Shreveport police saw him as a person of interest in the Grissom murders. Although he was never charged for the triple homicide in Shreveport, law enforcement were 100% sure he did it, and so was the family of the Grissoms. On the 25th of October 2006, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. Thank you for watching. If you want to hear more weekly content, please like and subscribe and press the notification bell.